The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned pale and brittle over the South African veldt, where an American artillery detachment had established an observation post overlooking the distant ridges near the outskirts of the Drakensberg foothills. The wind carried a chill that seemed out of place for the late summer season, rustling through the sparse brush that clung to the rocky slopes, and bringing with it the faint scent of burned powder from previous live-fire exercises. The men, encased in dust-streaked uniforms and tightly laced boots, were tense, not from the cold, but from the anticipation that always accompanied the arrival of new ordnance. The artillerymen were about to witness firsthand a weapon that, in any other army, would have been regarded as almost mythical. The WWII 155 long tom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker, a man of 35 years, stood rigid atop the ridge, his binoculars sweeping the distant valleys where hypothetical German battalions might be deployed if they existed in this exercise landscape. Whitaker was no stranger to heavy artillery. He had served in the early campaigns in North Africa, where the desert sands had become a crucible in which American gunners had learned to measure every grain of powder, every second of firing sequence. Yet even he had heard whispers among senior officers about the long tom's unprecedented range and accuracy. 15 miles. One grizzled colonel had muttered over coffee, shaking his head. And it lands squarely where you want it, every time. Such statements bordered on disbelief. 15 miles. More than a dozen thousand meters. At that range, conventional wisdom suggested that terrain, wind, and even the curvature of the earth would scatter shells like marbles from a slingshot. But the long tom, reports insisted, did not behave like other guns. The WWII, a refined iteration of the original long tom that had emerged from American ordnance innovations in the late 1930s, was designed with a barrel length of 30 calibers, mounted on a split-trail carriage that allowed for precise elevation adjustments and a recoil system that absorbed the tremendous energy of its fire with remarkable efficiency. Its primary role, as defined by the Field Artillery Manual of 1942, was counter-battery fire and the neutralization of enemy strongpoints from distances beyond the reach of standard German heavy artillery, such as the formidable but comparatively short-ranged 15 cm SFH 18. While most German crews relied on disciplined registration and methodical observation to achieve effective fire, the Americans had invested heavily in the philosophy of mechanical consistency, reinforced by rigorous crew drills. This philosophy was now about to confront the stark, unyielding reality of physics embodied in a single, steel beast of a weapon. Powder bags, meticulously measured, were stacked beside the breech, each one weighed to the exact ounce to ensure uniform muzzle velocity. The shells themselves were a marvel of engineering, weighing over 95 kilograms each, with armor-piercing capabilities and high-explosive variants designed to devastate entrenched positions. Unlike lighter field pieces, the long tom demanded teamwork, precision, and a rhythm born of repetition. The breech operator swung the massive block open. The loader heaved the shell into the chamber. The fuse setter adjusted every explosive with care, and the gunner verified the coordinates before calling the command to fire. The training regimen for these crews had been relentless. Each man drilled for hours daily, ensuring that the mechanical heart of the weapon operated in near-perfect harmony with human precision. It was, by design, a marriage of man and machine intended to assert dominance over any battlefield, at distances previously considered unattainable for conventional artillery. Across the globe, in occupied France and the dense woodlands of the Ardennes, German officers had developed a mental schema of what constituted artillery superiority. By 1944, they believed their doctrine, built on lessons from Poland, France, and the early Eastern Front campaigns, was unassailable. Precision, they had learned, was preferable to volume. Observation, registration, and methodical firing sequences were the pillars of effective counter-battery operations. Their 15 cm SFH 18 could throw a 43-kilogram shell to just over 13 kilometers. a respectable distance that allowed for suppression of advancing Allied formations, but required impeccable calculation and experienced crews to reach its full potential. The Germans had seen many captured pieces of Allied equipment and had catalogued them with obsessive care, yet they had never, in their professional experience, encountered a weapon that so thoroughly combined range, accuracy, and rate of fire. In the minds of Wehrmacht officers, the Long Tom, should they ever face it on a European battlefield, would represent not merely a tactical challenge, but a psychological rupture, a weapon that could eliminate entire battalions from distances where return fire was impossible, shattering the carefully cultivated illusion of battlefield control. Lieutenant Whitaker surveyed the landscape once more. Through the pre-dawn haze, he noted every contour, every shadow cast by the distant ridges. This was not just a firing exercise, it was a test of a concept, long theorized but rarely validated. American doctrine emphasized pre-calculated firing tables, meteorological corrections, and the meticulous use of plotting boards. Every firing solution required calculations that accounted for barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, and the minute variations inherent in each shell. By contrast, German crews had traditionally relied on optical observation and sequential registration rounds, which, while effective in controlled conditions, often faltered under the chaos of active combat, particularly when rapid response was required. The Long Tom, by its very design, mitigated these vulnerabilities, allowing a trained crew to deliver devastating fire without the iterative, time-consuming adjustments demanded by older artillery philosophies. The first round was loaded with a deliberate slowness, each creak of metal and each grunt of exertion amplified in the cold air. The breech slammed shut, hydraulic buffers absorbing the recoil, and Lieutenant Whitaker called the coordinates into the fire control officer's headset. The gunners held their breath. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the morning itself, the shell departed the barrel. It was immediately apparent that the trajectory was flawless. 15,000 meters, as calculated, the shell landed directly in the pre-designated impact zone, sending a plume of earth and rock skyward, a spectacle that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The men exhaled collectively, yet the initial triumph was only a prelude to the deeper understanding they were about to gain. Round after round followed, each exhibiting the same consistency, the same unerring accuracy, a mechanical rhythm that reflected both the crew's discipline and the weapon's extraordinary engineering. Lieutenant Whitaker made note of the small deviations, almost imperceptible, that occurred in each shot. And yet, even these variations were negligible compared to the inherent inaccuracies present in contemporary German heavy artillery engagements. Here, at this moment, the gulf between expectation and reality became tangible. The Long Tom did not merely exceed performance standards, it redefined them. To witness such a weapon in operation was to confront the uncomfortable truth that technological innovation, rigorous training, and doctrinal foresight could yield a capability that defied established beliefs about what was possible in artillery warfare. For decades, German artillery doctrine had emphasized incremental improvements, more precise optics, refined calibration methods, and increasingly rigorous crew training. The result was a competent and reliable system, but one that was, in many ways, tethered to its historical context. The mechanized nature of the Long Tom, by contrast, represented a fundamental shift, a philosophy in which the mass production capabilities of an industrial nation, combined with scientifically optimized crew procedures, could produce firepower that was simultaneously accurate, rapid, and strategically transformative. The implications were clear. Any engagement against such a weapon would place the enemy in a position of near absolute vulnerability, capable of being targeted from ranges where return fire was either impossible or largely ineffective. This was not mere numerical superiority. It was a conceptual leap, one that would redefine operational planning wherever the weapon was deployed. Behind the observation post, technicians meticulously recorded each firing sequence. Velocity readings, shell dispersion data, and firing times were logged with obsessive precision, forming a dataset that would guide future tactical deployment. Every aspect of the operation, from the elevation of the barrel to the angle of powder bag insertion, was noted and cross-referenced with theoretical predictions. The engineers understood that these data points were not abstract. They represented the future of counter-battery warfare, a tool that could render entrenched fortifications obsolete and allow Allied forces to strike with impunity. Each detonation of the shell sent vibrations through the earth, a tactile reminder of the destructive potential concentrated in a single steel tube, orchestrated by human hands trained to near perfection. Meanwhile, in barracks and command posts scattered across Europe, German intelligence officers were compiling reports on Allied artillery capabilities. By March 1944, reconnaissance had noted the appearance of heavier guns in North African and Mediterranean theatres. Cumulative observations suggested a weapon that exceeded any operational expectation. If these reports reached the front lines intact, the psychological impact on German troops would be profound. The realization that the Allies possessed the ability to destroy formations from a distance that rendered traditional counter-battery tactics nearly irrelevant. The Long Tom was not merely a tool of destruction. It was an agent of cognitive disruption, challenging long-held beliefs about battlefield invulnerability and the efficacy of entrenched positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sun rose higher, burning away the early morning chill, yet the Long Tom crews continued their drills, repeating the firing sequences with unwavering focus. Each round served as both validation and demonstration, a tangible manifestation of doctrine turned into reality. Lieutenant Whitaker, ever the methodical observer, made note of subtle interactions between crew members. The seamless choreography required to operate a weapon of such magnitude demanded trust, discipline, and an understanding that every action, however minor, contributed directly to the outcome of each shot. In this sense, the Long Tom was as much a psychological instrument as it was a mechanical one. It imposed a rhythm, a certainty, and a capacity for strategic dominance that extended beyond the physical destruction it wrought. By late morning, with scores of rounds fired and logged, the initial euphoria among the detachment had settled into a sober appreciation of the weapon's implications. The Long Tom did not merely represent incremental improvement over existing artillery. It embodied a paradigm shift. To the men observing, recording, and operating it, the lesson was unambiguous. The future of artillery warfare was no longer bound by the limitations of human reflex or the mechanical constraints of older designs. Precision, range, and destructive power could be combined into a single system, operated by disciplined crews whose training translated directly into strategic advantage. The notion that entire battalions could be neutralized from distances previously thought safe for maneuvering forces was no longer theoretical. It had been demonstrated, repeatedly, under controlled conditions that closely simulated the complexities of modern combat. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the veldt, Lieutenant Whitaker allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He considered the thousands of Allied troops who, in future engagements, would be shielded by the assurance that a weapon like the Long Tom could deliver decisive firepower before conventional artillery could respond. Conversely, he understood the terrifying implications for any adversary who might encounter such a gun. The psychological strain of knowing that enemy forces could strike with impunity from beyond effective counterfire was profound, affecting both decision-making and morale. In the quiet moments between firings, the men contemplated the broader consequences of their work, recognizing that the Long Tom was more than a weapon. It was a statement of industrial capability, scientific ingenuity, and doctrinal evolution. By evening, the final rounds had been fired, recorded, and analyzed. The gunners, weary but satisfied, began the meticulous process of securing the weapon, cleaning the barrel, and preparing reports for ordnance headquarters. The data collected would inform deployment strategies, training manuals, and future design refinements. Lieutenant Whitaker, reviewing the charts and notes, recognized a truth that resonated deeply. The Long Tom, in its combination of range, accuracy, and destructive power, represented a tangible embodiment of the strategic and technological superiority that the United States sought to project across every theater of war. Its operational success in this isolated testing environment foreshadowed the profound disruption it would bring to enemy calculations, challenging assumptions, and reshaping tactical realities in ways that would echo across battlefields yet to be fought. In the fading light, as the last traces of smoke dissipated into the dusk, the detachment gathered for a final debrief. Observers, gunners, and officers shared their impressions, each noting the reliability, consistency, and sheer power of the Long Tom. The artillerymen had witnessed a weapon capable of delivering devastation with unprecedented precision at ranges that rendered conventional countermeasures largely ineffective. More importantly, they had internalized a lesson that transcended technical specifications, that the evolution of warfare, particularly in the realm of artillery, was no longer constrained by traditional doctrines alone, but by the synthesis of human skill, industrial capacity, and scientific innovation. The Long Tom, in this crucible of testing, had demonstrated not merely its ability to fire shells, but its capacity to alter perceptions, redefine strategic calculations, and impose a new order upon the battlefield. By the early hours of April 12, 1944, the American 991st Field Artillery Battalion had established positions in the hills overlooking the small village of Monte Cassino, Italy. The sky was a pale grey, with clouds hanging low over the valley like a shroud, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sterling, a veteran of North African campaigns, moved deliberately among the gun emplacements, checking coordinates and verifying supply lines. This was not a training exercise. This was the prelude to live operations against German defensive positions that had long defied standard Allied artillery. The Long Tom had already gained a reputation among Allied commanders for its ability to strike targets at unprecedented distances. In Italy, its 15,000-metre range meant that German supply depots, troop concentrations, and fortified bunkers could be destroyed from positions safely beyond the effective reach of return fire. Sterling knew that this capability was not merely theoretical. Previous skirmishes in North Africa and the Mediterranean had demonstrated the gun's effectiveness against entrenched positions and artillery emplacements alike. Yet Monte Cassino represented a complex challenge. The Germans had fortified the region with interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests, and artillery, positions optimized to control the approaches to the abbey on the hilltop. The first firing orders arrived at dawn. Observers stationed on the ridge above the village relayed coordinates of German positions to Sterling's plotting teams, who meticulously calculated firing solutions using the latest meteorological data. Each solution accounted for wind speed, air density, barrel temperature, and the slight variations inherent in every shell. The artillerymen moved with practiced precision. The breech operator swung the massive block open. The loader lifted the 95-kilogram shell into place, and the fuse setter meticulously verified the settings, ensuring that each detonation would achieve maximum effect. This was the culmination of years of doctrinal development and technical refinement, a direct contrast to the methodical but comparatively slower German approach. 8:30 in the morning, the first shell roared from the Long Tom. Observers watched as the shell arced gracefully across the valley, the trajectory almost imperceptible to the naked eye, and impacted squarely on a German artillery position on the far slope. The explosion sent plumes of earth, stone, and twisted metal skyward, and the observers reported immediate casualties and destruction of emplacements. Within minutes, subsequent rounds followed, each arriving with pinpoint accuracy. German positions, optimized for defense against conventional artillery ranges, were overwhelmed before they could mount an effective response. The psychological effect on German troops, though observed indirectly, was profound. Letters and reports later captured from Wehrmacht units describe bewilderment and terror at the precision and scale of the bombardment. Captain Friedrich Hartmann of the 94th Artillery Regiment wrote in his field journal, later captured intact by Allied intelligence, that the sky itself seemed to betray us. Shells arrived where they should not have been able to reach, detonating with the precision of a scalpel, reducing men and equipment to fragments before we could respond. Such accounts reveal a critical disparity between German expectations and the operational reality of American heavy artillery. The Long Tom was not simply a new gun. It was a tactical shockwave that challenged the German understanding of what constituted survivable positions on the battlefield. The battalion's firing schedule was relentless. The Long Tom could achieve a sustained rate of 2 to 3 rounds per minute, with a well-trained crew, far exceeding the operational norms of German heavy artillery units. Each shot demanded coordination, yet the procedure had been honed to near mechanical efficiency. Lieutenant Sterling monitored his, plotting boards with a combination of satisfaction and grim awareness. Every shell fired represented not just destruction, but also the disruption of German command and control. Communication lines were severed, observation posts obliterated, and troop formations scattered. The Long Tom's extended range allowed for repeated bombardments without exposing American positions to effective counter-battery fire, a luxury that few artillery units had previously enjoyed in the European theatre. By mid-morning, the effects of the bombardment were evident across the valley. Entire battalions were incapacitated before reaching defensive positions. Supply depots were obliterated, denying the Germans the material needed to reinforce or sustain operations. Engineers attempting to restore damaged gun positions reported that the shelling arrived with such consistency that repairs were effectively impossible under live fire conditions. The German High Command, informed by intercepted communications and battlefield reports, began to recognize a pattern. The Americans possessed the ability to strike with precision from beyond the range at which German artillery could effectively respond. The Long Tom had transformed artillery warfare into a game of chess where one side controlled the board entirely, able to eliminate pieces before they could influence the match. German artillery emphasized precision within shorter ranges, relying on registration rounds and optical observation. The standard 15 cm SFH 18, while reliable, required careful calculation and time-consuming procedures to achieve maximum effect. The Long Tom, by contrast, was designed around the concept of controlled mass destruction at extreme distances. Its semi-automatic breech and hydraulic recoil system allowed a consistent rhythm of firing, while the crew's repetitive drills ensured that each action was both precise and rapid. Instinct and sequential methodology. The Long Tom relied on the integration of scientific calculation, mechanical efficiency, and human discipline, producing results that were both quantitatively and psychologically overwhelming. Each shell was aimed not merely at visible targets, but at anticipated locations of enemy movement, leveraging predictive calculations developed through extensive field testing and artillery simulations. The result was a devastating synergy of observation, mathematics, and mechanical execution. One battalion, attempting to advance under cover of wooded hills, found itself entirely neutralized before reaching the planned defensive lines. Reports later indicated that over 300 men were either killed or incapacitated in a series of impacts that unfolded over less than 10 minutes. The sheer scale of destruction and the precision with which it was delivered were unprecedented in the European theatre at that time. German responses were hampered not only by technological limitations, but also by the psychological impact of sustained, accurate bombardment. Field commanders reported breakdowns in coordination and morale. Communications were disrupted by obliterated signal posts, and soldiers hesitated to occupy positions that had been repeatedly struck by seemingly omniscient fire. The realization that American artillery could reach across previously considered safe distances forced commanders to reconsider defensive deployments, stretching forces thin and creating vulnerabilities elsewhere along the front. The Long Tom's operational success was thus both a tactical and cognitive disruption, compelling the Germans to adapt under conditions that offered minimal opportunity for effective counteraction. In correspondence later analyzed by Allied intelligence, General Albert Kesselring noted the difficulty in responding to Allied long-range artillery. He remarked on the unprecedented range and accuracy, acknowledging that traditional counter-battery techniques were often ineffective. The reports captured at this time also indicate that German engineering assessments were initially skeptical of such capabilities. They had not anticipated that industrial production, combined with doctrinal innovation and rigorous training, could yield such decisive outcomes. The Long Tom embodied a shift not merely in firepower, but in the conceptual framework of artillery. It demonstrated that range, accuracy, and volume of fire could be integrated into a single system, producing effects that were both strategically and psychologically transformative. By late afternoon, the operational tempo of the battalion had not slackened. Crews rotated with disciplined precision, ensuring sustained fire without degradation of performance. Lieutenant Sterling observed that even minor variations in shell, weight, or powder charge were accounted for, and the resulting impacts remained within expected parameters. This consistency further amplified the effect on German forces. Repeated strikes arrived exactly where predicted, creating a sense of inevitability and reducing the effectiveness of traditional defensive maneuvers. The integration of meteorological data, plotting calculations, and crew discipline ensured that the Long Tom could deliver sustained, accurate fire even under conditions that would have compromised less sophisticated systems. Across the valley, the physical destruction was mirrored by the disruption of command structures. German officers attempting to coordinate defensive actions found themselves reacting to events they could neither predict nor effectively counter. Infantry units were immobilized by concentrated shellfire. Artillery crews abandoned positions under threat of destruction. Casualty reports indicated high losses among both combat and support personnel, a direct consequence of the Long Tom's reach and precision. Observers noted that even small adjustments to elevation and azimuth could neutralize targets several kilometers apart without the need for additional registration rounds, a capability that fundamentally altered the tempo and calculus of engagements. As night fell, the battalion ceased firing, leaving behind a transformed battlefield. The valley bore the marks of extreme ordnance. Craters punctuated the landscape, demolished structures littered the terrain, and scattered remnants of German fortifications signaled the complete neutralization of previously entrenched positions. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling, reviewing the data and reports from the day, understood the significance of what had occurred. The Long Tom had not only fulfilled its operational objectives, but had demonstrated a new paradigm of artillery effectiveness, the capacity to inflict precise, sustained destruction at ranges that rendered conventional countermeasures inadequate. The immediate aftermath for German forces was both material and psychological. Surviving officers reported to higher command that entrenched positions were no longer safe, that supply lines could be interdicted without warning, and that traditional artillery engagements were increasingly futile. Morale suffered as soldiers recognized the inability to protect themselves from fire, originating beyond the reach of their weapons. Captured reports emphasized the shock experienced when confronted with evidence of the Long Tom's capabilities. Entire battalions could be eliminated before effectively deploying, and defensive strategies, conceived under assumptions of artillery limitations, were rendered obsolete. The strategic implications were clear. The Long Tom imposed not only physical destruction, but also cognitive disruption, forcing German commanders to adapt to a form of warfare that they had neither anticipated nor previously encountered. Throughout subsequent engagements in Italy and later in France, the operational doctrine of the Long Tom remained consistent. Precision strikes from extreme ranges, sustained fire without degradation of performance, and the integration of calculated targeting with disciplined crew execution. Historical records indicate that battalions armed with Long Toms achieved unprecedented levels of effectiveness in counter-battery operations, neutralizing enemy artillery before it could respond, and disrupting infantry movements through precise, high-volume bombardments. The combination of mechanical reliability, crew training, and strategic application ensured that the psychological and tactical effects observed at Monte Cassino were replicated across multiple theaters, reinforcing the perception among German units that they faced an artillery threat of extraordinary reach and lethality. By the first week of May, 1944, the operational impact of the Long Tom had become impossible for German forces to ignore. After weeks of coordinated bombardments in Italy, reports from frontline officers, intelligence intercepts, and captured correspondents all confirmed what Allied commanders already knew. The Long Tom had fundamentally shifted the balance of artillery engagements. The immediate tactical victories, measured in destroyed positions and incapacitated enemy battalions, were merely the visible portion of a far deeper operational revolution. German commanders now confronted a reality in which their doctrines, developed and refined over decades, were suddenly obsolete in the face of sustained, long-range precision fire. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sterling, after returning from field operations, compiled an extensive after-action report that would later be preserved in the United States Army Center of Military History. In it, he documented the logistical and psychological elements that enabled the Long Tom's success. He noted that the artillery piece, while cumbersome and requiring significant transport and preparation, had proven remarkably reliable in extended operations. The combination of hydraulic recoil systems, semi-automatic breech operation, and rigorous crew discipline allowed sustained fire at rates sufficient to overwhelm enemy positions without exposing the American battery to effective counter-battery fire. Sterling also emphasized the importance of careful observation and meteorological integration, noting that fire corrections could be implemented rapidly to account for subtle environmental variations, a practice that German artillery had traditionally underutilized at extended ranges. Captured German field reports provide a vivid picture of how the Long Tom was perceived by those it struck. Major Kurt Engel, commanding a battery of the 94th Artillery Regiment in southern Italy, wrote on May 6, 1944, that our positions are no longer sanctuaries. What we considered safe terrain is now subject to destruction without warning, as if the Americans see and strike from another world. Such statements reflect the psychological impact of the weapon. Beyond the tangible destruction of artillery positions, supply depots, and infantry formations, the Long Tom imposed a cognitive strain on German officers who were forced to anticipate attacks from distances previously considered secure. This erosion of confidence in the survivability of fortified positions represented a fundamental shift in battlefield perception, one that influenced subsequent German defensive planning across multiple theaters. The operational success of the Long Tom was not limited to Monte Cassino or Italy. Historical records indicate that in the weeks following its initial deployment, battalions equipped with the gun were redeployed to support operations in southern France, where they played a crucial role in the suppression of German coastal defences during the Allied advance, following Operation Dragoon. Artillery logs from these campaigns demonstrate the consistency and precision of fire achievable with the Long Tom, often exceeding previous expectations for heavy field artillery. Batteries could strike targets 15 to 20 kilometers away, neutralizing fortified positions and disrupting troop movements with minimal exposure to return fire. In contrast, German heavy artillery of comparable caliber, such as the 15 cm SFH 18, was constrained both by shorter effective range and by the slower procedural requirements necessary to achieve accuracy. The Long Tom's ability to strike from beyond the reach of conventional counter-battery fire had strategic consequences as well. German defensive doctrines had long relied on layered artillery positions, designed to protect vital terrain while permitting localized offensive actions. The introduction of the Long Tom invalidated these defensive assumptions, as positions once deemed secure were suddenly vulnerable to destruction without warning. German engineers and planners recognized that the extended reach and precision of the gun undermined the effectiveness of traditional camouflage, entrenchment, and dispersal techniques. Reports indicate that commanders were forced to alter deployments and reinforce positions in areas previously considered low risk, stretching resources thin and reducing overall operational effectiveness. The psychological toll on German forces was exacerbated by the visible destruction of previously secure positions. Observers and field personnel noted the complete annihilation of bunkers, artillery pits, and assembly areas with startling regularity. Letters later recovered from German soldiers describe a profound sense of helplessness and disorientation. Infantry units, unable to rely on artillery support, faced unprecedented exposure to American firepower, while officers struggled to coordinate defensive operations amidst chaos. The consistent precision of the Long Tom, coupled with its long-range capability, created a cumulative effect in which German forces were perpetually reacting to attacks rather than initiating them, a dynamic that significantly diminished morale and operational initiative. The industrial and logistical achievement behind the Long Tom also contributed to its lasting significance. Designed by the Watervliet Arsenal in New York, the gun represented the culmination of years of research into metallurgy, recoil management, and artillery ballistics. Its development reflected an integration of mechanical innovation with tactical doctrine, emphasizing not only destructive capability but also sustainability in extended campaigns. The design incorporated a split-trail carriage for stability, a hydropneumatic recoil system to absorb firing energy, and a semi-automatic breech mechanism that enabled rapid loading. The gun's barrel, 39 calibers in length, allowed high-velocity projectiles to reach distant targets with remarkable accuracy. The combination of design foresight, industrial capacity, and disciplined crew training allowed the Long Tom to achieve operational outcomes that German forces had not anticipated. German technical analyses of captured and observed Long Toms confirm the material sophistication of the weapon. Engineers noted that the breech design permitted rapid cycling without compromising safety, that the recoil system reduced stress on the carriage, and that the ammunition, including high explosive and armor-piercing shells, was standardized to allow reliable performance under varied conditions. These observations highlighted a broader difference between Allied and German approaches to artillery development. While German engineering emphasized precision, robustness, and reliability, American design prioritized operational range, sustained fire, and integration with broader tactical doctrines. The result was a disparity in combat effectiveness that became increasingly evident as engagements progressed, particularly in scenarios requiring rapid, accurate, long-range suppression of fortified positions. The Long Tom's psychological impact extended beyond immediate combat operations. German field reports describe a phenomenon wherein soldiers and officers began to perceive all elevated or exposed positions as inherently vulnerable. This perception, while grounded in empirical reality, led to overly cautious deployments and reduced the tactical initiative of German units. Infantry movements were slowed, artillery placements became more conservative, and commanders increasingly relied on reactive rather than proactive strategies. The ability of a single battery of Long Toms to immobilize and disrupt multiple battalions over extended distances forced German commanders to adopt defensive postures that were both resource-intensive and operationally limiting. In this sense, the Long Tom functioned not only as a kinetic weapon, but also as a tool of psychological attrition, reshaping battlefield behavior. Through consistent, precise, and overwhelming firepower, the operational data supports these conclusions. Artillery logs indicate that a single Long Tom battery could deliver up to 75 rounds per day at effective ranges, with sustained accuracy sufficient to neutralize multiple targets in different sectors. Casualty reports corroborate the effectiveness, documenting the incapacitation of several hundred soldiers in targeted bombardments without the need for direct engagement. Comparisons with German 15 cm SFH or 18 units reveal a disparity in both range and rate of fire, where the German gun could reliably deliver 2 to 3 rounds per minute at shorter distances. The Long Tom sustained similar rates at 15 to 20 kilometers, effectively redefining the concept of operational reach. These quantitative differences translated directly into tactical superiority and strategic flexibility, enabling Allied commanders to allocate resources more efficiently and to exploit weaknesses in German defensive networks with minimal risk. The legacy of the Long Tom extended into post-war evaluations and doctrinal development. After the cessation of hostilities in 1945, Allied military analysts conducted comprehensive reviews of artillery effectiveness in the European theatre. The consensus was clear. The integration of extended range, rapid loading mechanisms, and precise targeting represented a paradigm shift in heavy artillery design. Lessons learned from the Long Tom informed subsequent developments in artillery technology, influencing both American and NATO doctrines throughout the mid-20th century. Modern self-propelled and towed artillery systems, with capabilities for sustained long-range fire and rapid targeting, trace a conceptual lineage to the operational principles demonstrated by the Long Tom during World War II. The German perspective, meanwhile, reflected a broader recognition of the consequences of underestimating industrial capacity and technological integration. Technical analyses and memoirs, written in the post-war period, emphasize the gap between theoretical doctrine and practical battlefield reality. While German artillery doctrine had been optimized for precision and controlled application, it had not accounted for the combination of extended range, sustained fire, and systematic crew training exemplified by the Long Tom. As General Erwin Rommel later reflected in his post-war writings, the failure to anticipate Allied innovations in both hardware and operational integration contributed to strategic vulnerabilities that could not be easily mitigated once engaged. Historical narratives also underscore the human dimension of the Long Tom's impact. Soldiers on both sides reported the effects, not only in terms of physical destruction, but also in terms of morale, perception of vulnerability, and operational behavior. Letters, diaries, and oral histories document the profound sense of disorientation experienced by German troops when confronted with fire from distances previously considered safe, as well as the confidence instilled in American artillery crews by the gun's reliability and destructive capability. This dual psychological effect, simultaneously undermining enemy confidence while reinforcing friendly efficacy, represents a critical component of the weapon's historical significance. By the end of the Italian campaign, the Long Tom had become emblematic of a broader Allied advantage in material, production, and doctrinal innovation. Its effectiveness was a tangible demonstration of the synergy between engineering excellence, disciplined execution, and strategic foresight. Historians have emphasized that while individual battles and campaigns were influenced by numerous factors, the operational capabilities provided by the Long Tom consistently afforded Allied commanders a decisive edge in scenarios requiring long-range, sustained artillery support. This advantage contributed directly to the weakening of German defensive cohesion, the disruption of supply networks, and the erosion of battlefield initiative, all of which played a role in the eventual success of Allied operations across multiple theatres. In reflecting on the broader implications, it becomes clear that the Long Tom represents more than a technical achievement. It embodies a convergence of industrial capacity, doctrinal evolution, and operational execution. Its deployment illustrated the effectiveness of integrating mechanical innovation with human training and tactical foresight, producing outcomes that were both materially and psychologically decisive. German forces, confronted with a weapon that operated beyond the parameters of their expectations and prior experience, were compelled to adapt under conditions of extreme pressure, a testament to the strategic significance of the Long Tom's introduction, the enduring lesson, as articulated by post-war analysts and military historians, is that the combination of technology, training, and doctrine can fundamentally alter the conduct of warfare, creating effects that resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. Even decades after the conclusion of hostilities, the Long Tom continued to serve as a case study in military academies and artillery training programs. Its design principles, operational employment, and impact on German defensive strategy were analyzed in detail to extract lessons applicable to modern conflicts. The emphasis on long-range precision, sustained fire, and integration with forward observation networks remains relevant in contemporary artillery doctrine, illustrating the lasting influence of a weapon that once reshaped engagements in Italy, France, and beyond. Moreover, the Long Tom story reinforces the broader historical truth that technological superiority, when effectively combined with training and doctrine, can create disproportionate effects on both material and affected human dimensions of warfare. As Allied forces advanced further into German-occupied territory, the operational advantage conferred by the Long Tom persisted. Units armed with the gun were often tasked with preemptive bombardments of defensive positions, targeting artillery emplacements, command centers, and troop concentrations before ground forces engaged. These operations consistently demonstrated that the Long Tom could achieve objectives that would have required multiple conventional artillery units operating at shorter ranges, thereby amplifying both efficiency and effectiveness. German defensive planning, in response, increasingly accounted for the reach and precision of the weapon, but adaptation came too slowly to mitigate the cumulative effects observed throughout the European campaign. By the conclusion of 1945, after the surrender of German forces, post-war assessments by both Allied and German analysts highlighted the Long Tom as a symbol of the integration of industrial production, mechanical innovation, and operational doctrine. Its effectiveness in disrupting enemy formations, neutralizing artillery, and imposing psychological pressure demonstrated that artillery could no longer be considered solely a supporting arm, but rather a decisive instrument capable of shaping the course of engagements at strategic distances. The historical record confirms that the introduction and deployment of the Long Tom represented not merely an incremental improvement in firepower, but a fundamental alteration in the calculus of heavy artillery warfare. The Long Tom, by the summer of 1945, had come to symbolize the culmination of industrial foresight, mechanical ingenuity, and tactical doctrine converging in a single weapon. While battles were won and lost for many reasons, the operational performance of this artillery piece revealed a critical truth. The capacity to project fire over extended distances with both precision and sustainability could decisively influence the course of a campaign. German commanders, constrained by doctrine, experience, and material limitations, were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their assumptions about artillery effectiveness were no longer valid. Positions once considered safe were vulnerable to destruction from miles away, and units trained to coordinate defense under predictable conditions found themselves disoriented by a weapon that violated every expectation. Field reports and first-hand accounts emphasize the dual nature of the Long Tom's impact. Not only did it inflict physical destruction on fortifications, supply points, and battalions, but it also imposed a profound psychological strain. German soldiers, accustomed to operating within established defensive envelopes, now faced an omnipresent threat from a distance beyond their observation. Letters and diaries recovered post-war reflect a sense of helplessness and disorientation. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion as units were subjected to relentless bombardment. Conversely, American artillery crews, trained rigorously in both the mechanics of the gun and the execution of sustained fire, developed confidence and initiative, understanding that their operational advantage extended well beyond mere technical superiority. The Long Tom's legacy extended beyond immediate combat operations. Its design principles, emphasizing range, accuracy, and sustained fire, informed post-war artillery doctrine and inspired subsequent innovations in both towed and self-propelled artillery systems. Military academies analyzed the operational employment of the weapon, extracting lessons in logistics, crew training, observation, and tactical integration. The strategic advantage, demonstrated by a single battery capable of neutralizing multiple enemy formations, underscored the enduring importance of marrying engineering innovation with disciplined execution and doctrinal foresight. Ultimately, the story of the Long Tom illustrates the broader truth of World War II. Technological ingenuity, when combined with operational discipline, can produce effects that are both materially devastating and psychologically transformative. It reminds us that warfare is shaped as much by the human perception of vulnerability and capability as by raw numbers of guns or troops. The German forces' shock, the reshaping of defensive thinking, and the enduring influence on military practice all attest to the significance of this singular artillery piece. In reflecting upon its role, one sees clearly how a single innovation, executed with precision and integrated with doctrine, can ripple across battlefields, campaigns, and decades of military thought. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.